I never thought I'd live to see the day my own son's wife would raise her hand against me in my own house. One moment I was asking politely to pass the bread. The next, her palm cracked across my face, followed by the hot sting of her spit. The sound echoed through the dining room louder than any words could. My son just sat there, frozen, his fork halfway to his mouth. Then she turned to him and said, "Tell your father to leave. This is our home now. Our home. The house I built, the one my late wife and I paid for brick by brick." I stood there, my face burning, my dignity shattered, but not for long. Because humiliation has a strange way of sharpening a man. That night, as they laughed in the living room, I sat alone in the dark and made a promise. They wanted me gone. Fine, I'd leave. But not before taking back everything they'd stolen from me, the house, the cars, the accounts, every trace of comfort I'd once handed over in trust. They thought the old man was broken. What they didn't know was that I still held every key, every document, every secret they'd built their lives on. By the time they realized what I'd done, it was too late. Stay until the end, because this isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about a father who lost everything in one night and made sure those who destroyed him paid for it in full. My name is Edward Miller. I'm 68 years old, a retired architect who once designed homes filled with light and laughter. I built a modest career in Denver, raised one son, and spent 40 years married to a woman named Ellen who believed that every dinner table could heal a family. When she passed away 3 years ago, I tried to keep that tradition alive, one Sunday dinner each week, no matter how busy everyone was. It was my way of keeping her spirit close. That evening started like so many others. I set the table for 4, polishing the same silverware Ellen had chosen when we were young, and broke but proud. The roast was nearly done, its scent drifting through the house, mingling with the faint notes of her favorite music playing from the old speaker in the corner. Michael, my son, arrived first as usual, his tie loosened, his phone still in his hand. Claire followed, wearing her polished smile that never quite reached her eyes. My granddaughter Sophie ran straight into my arms, her laughter like the last bit of warmth in the room. "Smells wonderful," Dad Michael said, setting down a bottle of wine. He looked tired but distant, the way people do when they've learned to live with tension. Claire brushed past him and me, adjusting the flowers I'd arranged in the center. "Roses again?" she asked. "They make the house feel like a funeral." I forced a smile. They were Ellen's favorite. Claire's lips tightened. "Of course." We sat down to eat, and for a few blessed minutes the clinking of forks filled the silence. Sophie told me about her art project at school, something about drawing a family tree. "I put you at the top, Grandpa," she said proudly, "because you built our house." My chest warmed. "That's right, sweetheart. Every branch needs roots." Claire's fork stopped midway to her mouth. "Some branches get old and start taking up space, though," she said, her tone light but her eyes sharp. Michael shifted uncomfortably. "Claire." She ignored him. "I mean, you've had a good run, Edward. Most people your age move into a nice community, make friends their own age. You'd love it, shuffleboard bingo nights." Her voice sliced through the air, each word wrapped in sugar and poison. I set down my fork carefully. "This is my home too, Claire." She laughed softly. "Technically, it's Michael's. We've talked about this, haven't we, honey?" Michael didn't look up. He stared at his plate like it could save him. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the old clock Ellen had bought at a yard sale decades ago. I remembered her saying that sound will keep us grounded. Now it just counted down the seconds to humiliation. "Claire," I said, keeping my voice, "even your mother-in-law believed that family dinners were sacred. She thought food could bring people together." Claire's smile vanished. "Well, she's not here anymore, is she?" The words hit like a slap before the real one came. I felt the sting before I understood what had happened. Her palm cracked against my cheek, sharp and deliberate, the kind of slap meant to leave more than a mark. Then before I could move, she spat. The hot sting of it landed on my face, sliding down like everything I'd tried to hold together. Michael rose halfway, his chair scraping the floor. "Claire, stop!" She turned on him. "Stop what he's been living here rent-free for 3 years, eating our food, sitting in Ellen's shrine of a house, acting like he still runs this family. Well, it's time he remembered whose name is on the mortgage." My throat burned. "Whose name paid for that mortgage?" Her eyes flashed. "Yours or Ellen's insurance money, that did it." Michael flinched like the words had come from me. I saw him sink back down, torn between shame and fear. The silence that followed was unbearable. I could hear Sophie's breathing quicken beside me. I stood slowly, the chair legs creaking against the floorboards I'd installed with my own hands decades ago. My cheek throbbed, but I kept my voice calm. "You don't have to worry, Claire. You won't have to see me much longer." Good, she snapped. Michael, tell your father it's time to leave. Tonight, Michael's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His silence was the final betrayal. Sophie slid from her seat and ran to me, wrapping her arms around my waist. Don't go, Grandpa. Please. Her voice cracked on the word please, and something inside me almost broke. I knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You remember what I always tell you? I asked. She nodded through tears. Family means taking care of each other. I forced a smile. That's right, sweetheart. Don't forget it. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair and slipped it on slowly. My hands trembled not from anger but from the weight of what had just died in that room. As I turned toward the door, I caught Michael's reflection in the window, his head bowed, his wife standing triumphant behind him, and my granddaughter's small figure trembling in the corner. I opened the door, the night air biting against my face where her slap still burned. The world outside felt cold but honest, at least more honest than that dining room. One day, I said softly, not turning back, you'll understand what you've lost. Then I stepped out into the darkness, the sound of Ellen's clock fading behind me, each tick echoing like a farewell. The night air bit the place on my cheek where her hand had landed, and I kept my eyes on the thin ribbon of highway unspooling in my headlights. I drove without the radio, letting the hum of the engine steady my breathing. Town lights thinned to ranch gates and fence posts, then to nothing at all, just the high plains and a winter sky pricked with cold stars. I knew every mile between that house and the timberline where our old cabin sits, knew which bends hid black ice and which dips pooled fog. The road had carried me to celebrations and to funerals. Tonight it carried me away, not because I was lost, but because I needed space to remember who I had been before someone told me I was a burden. When the gravel turned under my tires and the pines swallowed the last of the county road, I rolled down the window and let the resine-scented air pour in. The cabin came into view the way an old friend does at a crowded station, plain, steady, unmistakable. The porch still sagged at the far corner where the snowplow had clipped it one spring. The lamp above the door still wore the little brass shade Ellen found at a flea market and polished till it caught the morning. I parked, shut off the engine, and sat in the hush that follows motion, the kind of silence you can feel on your skin. I unlocked the door and the hinges complained in the same places. Inside, the air held the faint smell of cedar and dust, and beneath that something like Ellen's hand cream, the kind with lavender on the label. I didn't turn on the overhead. I used the small lamp by the armchair, the one we bought after the first winter here when we realized the evenings would be longer than we were used to. The light created a honeyed circle on the old rug, leaving the corners in velvet shadow. The safe is hidden in plain sight. I built the bookshelf myself and set the panel so a firm press on the second shelf releases a latch. I'd designed a dozen spaces like it for clients who wanted to tuck away heirlooms or papers they hoped never to need in a hurry. Even when my hands are steady, that panel needs 2 tries. Tonight it clicked open on the first. I knelt, spun the combination, lifted the metal door, and breathed out when the cool air inside met my face. The envelopes were where I'd left them, rubber-banded, labeled in my block letters, because Ellen said my cursive looked like a spider's tantrum. Deed, primary residence, tax, property, insurance, titles. I carried the stack to the armchair and sat down, the leather groaning under my weight the way it always has. I slit the first envelope with my thumbnail and laid the deed across my knees. The paper had the crispness of something important, the kind of fiber that resists folding, that remembers how it has been handled. Names, dates, parcel numbers, legal descriptions that run on like dry creek beds full of stones. And there, right where it needed to be, my name. Mine, not ours, not theirs, mine. I read it once, then again, as if the letters might change in the time it takes to blink. I traced the signature that used to embarrass me because the capital M leans too far forward, impatient. Ellen liked to tease me that even my handwriting kept moving. You never did learn how to stop, she would say, and kiss the smudge on my thumb. The second envelope held copies, certified, and stamped, the clerk's embossed seals pebbled under my fingertips. The dates formed a chain back through seasons. I can still taste apple pies cooling on the sill, paint drying on baseboards, while football murmured from the television, the soft thud of Sophie's first steps on these very boards. These pages did not argue. They did not humiliate. They simply told the truth in ink. I stacked them carefully, aligned the corners, and felt the thrum in my chest settle into something like a pulse I recognized. Beneath the papers, tucked into the safe as if it were an afterthought, lay a small flash drive on a key ring. Ellen had tied a bit of red ribbon to it years ago, so we wouldn't confuse it with a car fob. I rolled the ribbon between my fingers. It had faded from holiday red to the color of old cherries. I brought the laptop from the desk, the one I use for taxes and the occasional blueprint I can't resist drafting, and slid the drive into the port. The screen woke lit my hands and found the single file named with her tidy habit for Ed. I clicked. There was a breath of static, then her voice filled the room. Time is cruel to some sounds. It had been kind to hers, warm, even threaded with a smile I could see as surely as if she stood by the sink drying a mixing bowl with the old cotton towel. "Hi, Ed. If you're hearing this, it means you're carrying too much again," she said. I closed my eyes. I could picture the day she made the recording hair pulled back with a pencil, glasses sliding down her nose because she never remembered to get them adjusted. "I just wanted to say one thing," she continued. "If they've forgotten who you are, remind them quietly." The clip ended. No lecture. No step-by-step instruction. Just that sentence cut to the bone. She had known I would try to fix things with patience until patience was used as a hammer on my skull. She had known I would need the permission not to shout. The lamp made a small pool of gold on the documents. The rest of the room turned to twilight. I listened again. The line fit into the cabin like it had always lived here, a sentence that belonged to the wood and the wool and the view through the west window where the mountains keep their own counsel. I thought of Ellen at this table, the winter we ran out of firewood in a snowstorm and she broke up an old pallet with a crowbar, laughing while the stove ate the scrap and the room came back to life. She never mistook gentleness for weakness. She never confused silence with surrender. I shut the laptop and sat with the papers spread across my knees, the edges pressing faint creases into my trousers. Outside, a gust ran through the pines and the eaves answered with a soft complaint. Somewhere under the porch, a squirrel scolded no one in particular, as if the night itself had offended. The clock in here is quieter than the one in town, but I could hear it if I listened. I didn't need its counting to know the moment for pleading had passed. Something else moved into its place, something with a straight back. I am not a man who enjoys anger. It eats more than it burns. But there is a kind of heat that welds instead of scorches, that binds what has been fractured without leaving jagged edges. I could feel it in my palms where the paper met skin and the steadiness that came to my breath. I slid the documents back into their sleeves, not to hide them, but to honor them. Proof doesn't need display, it needs care. I returned the flash drive to the ring and set it on the table beside the lamp where I would see it in the morning. The room dimmed as the bulb warmed down toward amber. The cabin had always been a place to reset, to remember that the life we made wasn't just a collection of rooms, but a promise about how to live inside them. I leaned back and let the old leather hold my weight. In the quiet, I could almost hear the soft tap of Ellen's wedding band against a mug, the way she punctuated a good idea with that bright little sound. I wasn't thinking about speeches or confrontations. I wasn't thinking about winning. I was thinking about restoring the balance of a home built on respect, about placing weight back where it belonged. My fingers tightened around the envelope with my name on it. This isn't revenge, it's restoration. Morning came gray and thin through the cabin windows, the kind of light that blurs the edges of things before the sun commits to showing itself. I sat at the table with a cup of coffee gone cold and the envelope of documents spread out before me. The silence had a weight to it, the sort that lets old memories push their way forward uninvited. I wasn't thinking about lawsuits or revenge strategies yet. I was thinking about Claire, not the woman who'd spit on me across the dinner table, but the girl who once stood in the doorway of my office clutching a portfolio too big for her arms. She couldn't have been more than 23 back then, hair tied back in a messy bun, nerves wound tight. My firm was small, specialized in residential design craft homes, we called them. I hired her because she reminded me of Ellen at that age, too idealistic to see limits, too earnest to notice the world sharpening its teeth. She had a quick eye for detail, a gift for how spaces breathe. Ellen noticed it first. "That girl," she said one night as we reviewed intern applications at the kitchen table, "she sees light the way you do. Don't let her go." Claire started as an intern who worked longer hours than anyone else. She'd come in early, sweep the drafting floor, sharpen the pencils, and stay past midnight to revise blueprints she didn't even own. There was hunger in her, part ambition, part fear. Ellen made it her mission to feed the right side of that hunger. She took Claire shopping for proper work clothes, helped her write scholarship essays, even taught her how to hold her ground in client meetings. "Confidence isn't arrogance," Ellen told her once during a design review. "It's just honesty about what you can do." I remember watching them through the glass wall of my office, Ellen leaning over Claire's shoulder, both of them laughing at something I couldn't hear. There was a softness in Claire, then a kind of gratitude she didn't know how to express except through work. She brought us coffee every morning, even learned how Ellen liked hers with too much sugar. When she got accepted into a master's program in California, Ellen cried as if Claire were our own child leaving home. I remember the day we threw her a small farewell lunch at the firm. She promised she'd come back someday, start her own design studio. "You'll make us proud," Ellen said, hugging her like a mother. But life doesn't keep people the way we remember them. Years later, after Ellen passed, Claire did come back older, sharper, her kindness trimmed into precision. She'd traded laughter for polish, traded wonder for strategy. She called one afternoon out of the blue, her voice sweet but rehearsed. "Mr. Miller," she said, though she used to call me Ed. "I've been developing a boutique real estate project. It's going to change the face of downtown. I'd love for you to invest." I was lonely then. Ellen had been gone 6 months, and Michael had buried himself in work. The house felt too quiet, too large. Claire visited with blueprints and glossy renderings, her confidence, now something almost theatrical. She wore a designer suit, a watch that gleamed like armor. For a few hours I forgot the ache in my chest. She talked about market trends and sustainable living and how Ellen had inspired her sense of human architecture. It was flattery wrapped in vision, and I let it warm me. When she asked for a $200,000 loan, just temporary funding, until investor paperwork cleared, I didn't think twice. I wrote the check that night. She hugged me before leaving. "You won't regret this, Ed," she said, eyes shining. "I'll make you proud." For months, I believed her. She sent occasional updates, each one promising returns that never arrived. Then one day, she stopped answering calls. The office number disconnected. A year later, I saw her name again, this time on Michael's phone when he came to Sunday dinner. Claire Stevens, the contact read, though the voice on the other end now called me Dad. When Michael introduced her as his fiancée, I felt the air shift. I'd learned enough about human nature to recognize calculated charm when I saw it, but I wanted to believe she'd changed. Ellen always said people grow if you give them room. I gave Claire room. I gave her forgiveness for the loan she never repaid. I gave her the same trust Ellen had once given her, and in return she gave me distance, disdain, and eventually humiliation. Looking back, I can see the moment the light went out behind her eyes. It wasn't sudden. It dimmed slowly the way dusk replaces day, quiet, inevitable. Maybe Ellen's death broke something in her too. She'd lost the only person who'd ever loved her without expecting profit. Maybe she mistook survival for strength and control for safety. Or maybe she simply learned how easy it is to build a life out of other people's kindness. I still keep the loan agreement. It's in a folder labeled Personal Confidential, the paper yellowed at the edges, her signature looping neatly across the bottom. Sometimes I wonder what she thought when she wrote it. Did she intend to repay me then? Or had she already learned that promises are just another kind of currency? I traced the ink with my thumb, feeling the indentation her pen left in the fiber. My anger had cooled into something quieter, a recognition maybe of how easily compassion turns into leverage in the wrong hands. Ellen once told me, "When someone betrays you, Ed, it's not always because they hated you. Sometimes it's because they never learned what love really was." I leaned back in the chair, the envelope crinkling softly in my lap. The cabin's clock ticked, echoing faintly off the wooden walls. Somewhere outside, the wind moved through the trees, whispering in a language older than all of us. I pictured Claire as that young woman again, standing in my office doorway, trying to prove she deserved a place in a world that never gave her one. I wondered if she even remembered the way Ellen had believed in her, had shielded her, when rumors at the firm accused her of mishandling client funds. Ellen had defended her without hesitation. "She's not dishonest," she told me afterward. "She's just scared of being poor again." Maybe that fear never left her. Maybe every cruel word she threw at me was just a shield forged out of that same old terror. It didn't excuse her, but it made sense of the ruin. And maybe understanding is its own form of vengeance, the kind that doesn't rot your soul afterward. I slipped the paper back into its sleeve and closed the folder. My reflection in the window looked older, yes, but also clearer than it had in years. The truth about Claire wasn't just about money or deceit or ambition. It was about what happens when people forget who helped them climb. I turned off the lamp and let the room go dark again, the document still warm in my hands. Some debts aren't about money. Morning steadied me the way a level steadies a beam. I put the folder back in the safe, locked the latch, and drove down from the pines toward town past hayfields, glazed with frost and a pair of mule deer nosing at a ditch for water. Mark Jensen's office sits above the hardware store he inherited from his father. He keeps the old sign even though he hasn't sold a bolt in 20 years. When I climbed the creaking stairs, his door was already cracked open. He prefers daylight to lamps and law to theater, which is why I trust him. He looked up from a stack of forms through round, wire-rimmed glasses and smiled without showing teeth. "Ed," he said, "you look like a man who's run out of excuses." I took the chair by the window. The street below was waking delivery truck, a boy on a bicycle, an early walker with a dog tugging for the lamppost. I placed the envelope on his desk and he pulled on his readers like a mason putting on gloves. We didn't exchange pleasantries. After 40 years of friendship, you can skip that part without losing anything. He flipped through the deed, the tax receipts, the copies with the clerk's raised seal. His finger paused over my signature and the filing date. He nodded once, a small, satisfied movement. "It's clean," he said. "You're the legal owner of the house and the vehicles. No transfers recorded, no liens you didn't authorize. Whatever story they've told themselves, the paper doesn't tell it." I felt something uncoil in my chest. Not triumph alignment. "Good," I said. "I don't want to fight in court, Mark. I don't want headlines or a spectacle. I want the truth to stand up without me shouting for it." He leaned back, laced his fingers over his stomach, and studied me the way he studies a tricky paragraph in a statute. "Then you'll need patience and clean hands," he said. "You have both. I do now." I told him what I intended, not to punish, but to restore the weight to its rightful place. "I'll take back everything, not out of anger, but balance." He didn't write that down, but I saw it register. He set the folder aside and pulled a legal pad toward him. "All right," he said. "We let the facts do the work." He drew 3 boxes and labeled them with a dull pencil. Housing, vehicles, accounts. Under housing, he wrote notice of occupancy and keys. "You changed the locks?" he asked. "Not yet." "We won't start with locks," he said. "We start with notices. Formal, polite, correct. We inform them the owner will be inspecting the property on a certain date and time. No threats, just presence." Paper has a way of rearranging posture. Under vehicles, he wrote title reissue and insurance update. "You'll notify the DMV you're assuming full control of the titles," he said, "and update the policies to remove unauthorized drivers. No tow trucks in the night unless they force your hand. Make it boring. Boring is devastating." Under accounts, he paused. "You have joint accounts." "A few from when Ellen managed the bills," I said. "I never closed them." "Then we close the door they're using to heat the house with your firewood," he said. "You're the primary. You can freeze or restrict without explanation. Be courteous to the bank. It's not their drama." He looked back up. "No lawsuits, no countersuits. If they file something frivolous, we answer with documents. If they make noise, we don't." Silence unsettles people used to winning with volume. I watched the pencil moving on the pad, the simple machinery of order at work. "And Sophie," I asked, the name catching on a ridge in my throat. Mark set the pencil down. "Document everything that pertains to her welfare," he said. "Dates, times, comments made in front of her. If there's evidence you haven't told me about, bring it when you're ready. For now, do nothing that could be called retaliation. Courts like the steady parent." Steady, the word fit better than strong. I could be steady. He tore the sheet from the pad and slid it across the desk. His handwriting was a column of quiet instructions. "This is a week's worth of work," he said. "You do this right, you won't have to raise your voice." I folded the page and tucked it into my coat pocket. For the first time since the dinner table split open beneath my feet, I felt the floor hold. Mark removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Ed, you understand there will be fallout," he said. "They'll flail. They'll try to turn embarrassment into outrage. They'll bait you." "I won't bite," I said. He studied me another beat, then stood and offered his hand. "Then go be the man Ellen married," he said. He knew how to let the truth do his speaking. Back on the street, the day had brightened into a kind of brittle blue that Colorado does better than anywhere. I walked to the bank 2 doors down, nodded to the teller who used to flirt with Ellen about her garden, and asked to speak with the branch manager. We sat in a glass cubicle where you can hear your own pulse if you listen for it. I placed my identification and the list from Mark on the desk. The manager skimmed the accounts, glanced at the signatures, and adopted the tone professionals use when they understand more than they're saying. "We can take care of this for you, Mr. Miller," she said. Would you like the changes to take effect immediately? My mouth was dry, but my voice didn't shake. Yes, I said. Please. She clicked through a series of screens, then looked up. Anything else I exhaled felt the last of the old hesitation lift like dust in sunlight and nodded. Freeze, every joint account. The branch manager's polite nod was still in my mind when I stepped back into the pale noon and felt the first real stillness I'd known in days. Actions have a temperature, some burn, some cool. What I'd set in motion carried the clean chill of a mountain stream. I drove home without the radio and opened my old ledger at the kitchen table, the one Ellen used to tease me about because I kept handwritten notes even when spreadsheets would do. I called the lender first. The woman on the line confirmed my identity, read the account number twice, and waited while I asked her to stop the automatic draft on the mortgage tied to my property. I didn't raise my voice or explain my reasons. Owners do not justify, they instruct. She told me a notice would be generated and mailed to the address on file. Good. Paper leaves footprints. After that, I called the dealership where we'd serviced the BMW for years. Titles mattered less to them than signatures, and I had both. I arranged for them to collect the car for a scheduled service and title update, names and coverage aligned according to the forms Mark had outlined. The service manager recognized my name and said they'd send a driver within the hour. I thanked him and walked outside to wait. When the driver arrived, he was a kid with neat hair and a careful smile. He glanced at the house as if it might bite. I handed him the spare fob and watched the sun flash on the hood as he pulled away, a clean, professional motion, no tires squealing, no scenes. In small towns, the loudest thing you can do is stay calm. I made tea and sat with the steam rising. The quiet felt earned. My phone buzzed mid-afternoon, a message from an old neighbor who never calls unless the holidays or a hailstorm demand it. You seeing this, he wrote, followed by a link. I pressed play. The video opened on a lobby I recognized from advertisements. Stone fountain, orchids, water murmuring over glass. The spa is where the town's successful go to prove it to one another in robes. The camera wobbled. Whoever filmed was pretending not to, then steadied on Claire standing at the front desk. She wore a white wrap and impatience. The receptionist smiled the way people smile when they've been trained not to show their teeth. Claire slid a card across the counter, tapped her nails, glanced at the phone. She can't go 5 minutes without consulting. The receptionist scanned, frowned, tried again. Claire laughed too loudly. The sound echoed off the stone like something brittle cracking. The receptionist spoke softly, but the mic caught enough. I'm sorry, ma'am. It isn't going through. Claire told her to run it again. They did. Twice. Someone off camera murmured. You could feel the room lean in. Claire shifted from charm to command, the way a person changes lanes without signaling. Another card. Another small shake of the head. The receptionist offered to call the bank. Claire snatched the card back, and for a second the filming hand dipped, then rose higher, bolder, now that a story had begun. Do you know who I am? Claire asked, and the line would have sounded grand if it hadn't landed on tile. The manager appeared, practiced empathy in place. He offered to set the bill aside if she could provide an alternate method. Claire pointed to the gold logo on the wall, said something about membership tiers and clients like me, as if the room might apologize for the inconvenience she had become. The manager kept his voice gentle. We can hold your appointment, ma'am. Perhaps a bank call would resolve it. She tried to laugh again and failed. A man in the waiting area coughed to hide his grin. The person filming moved closer, the camera lifting to catch the way Claire's face changed when she realized the audience had arrived. She reached for her phone and stepped away, but there is no privacy in a place designed for mirrors. The video cut suddenly and then resumed in the parking lot, the robe replaced by street clothes in a hurry, hair pulled back too tight. A woman whispered to her friend, maybe she's not as rich as she thinks. Someone else replied, told you it was insurance money. The camera held on Claire as she stabbed at her screen, lips thin, then slid into the driver's seat of a luxury sedan that as of an hour ago was no longer hers to drive. The car didn't start. Push-button systems don't respond to pride. The comments below the clip had bred in the time it took to boil water. People I'd known for 30 years became a chorus. She stiffed my cousin on a closing. Acted like she owned the town. Always said that house wasn't really his. There was spite in it, yes, but also a familiar small-town arithmetic pretense. Minus proof equals theater. I set the phone down and let the tea cool. No gloating rose up to meet me, only a steadier breath. The deed sat on the counter where I'd left it, stubborn as a plumb line. Silence can be louder than outrage if you let it do the talking. I pressed play again and watched the lobby scene once more, not for her humiliation, but for the fact that nothing in the video required me to raise a hand. Gravity had simply been reintroduced to a life that had learned to float on other people's air. I closed the app, the room returning to its natural proportions, and turned the cup in my hands as if it could measure time. Public pride, private decay. I had just set the phone face down and let the room return to its quiet when the doorbell rang, a small, polite sound that didn't match the way my heart jumped. Out here, deliveries are rare and visitors rarer. On the mat sat a padded envelope with no return address, my name written in tidy block letters. I carried it to the table, slid it open with a butter knife, and slid out a scuffed tablet with a purple case worn smooth at the corners. I knew that case. Sophie had picked it out on a back-to-school trip, pressing it to her chest like treasure. The screen came alive on the second try, low battery icon blinking, and a single video thumbnail waiting. 47 minutes. I plugged the charger into the wall, sat down, and pressed play. The first image was grainy kitchen light and the edge of a countertop. The angle told me the tablet was propped behind the fruit bowl, or leaned against a cookbook, clever the way children learn to be when adults forget how loud they sound. Claire's voice entered from off-camera, sharp as a knife sliding from a drawer. She was angry about the electric bill, about groceries, about my chair, pulled out half an inch from the table. "He eats and he sits and he takes," she said. The camera didn't move, but I could feel Sophie's small hand somewhere nearby, steady as a hummingbird at a flower. The scenes changed with the rhythm of a home that never rests. Afternoon sun across the living room. The television low. My name used like a problem to be solved. She mimicked the way I walked, lifted her shoulders to show a man bent by years. Michael's voice floated in now and then, trying to soften her, trying to disappear. "It's temporary," he said once. "He'll figure something out." "He'll figure it out when he's gone," Claire answered. "When he's gone, we'll finally be free." The next cut was the dining room. I recognized the way the late light falls through the west window, a warm stripe across the wall. Ellen once painted a shade called Harvest Wheat. Claire stood at one end of the table holding a stack of papers. "If you'd sell, we could breathe," she told Michael, pressing the papers into his hands. "It's just a house," she said, as if a roof were a shell shed by a creature that didn't need shelter anymore. Michael stared at the documents and said nothing, the kind of silence that makes a person smaller every time they choose it. A shorter clip caught my voice from another room asking if anyone wanted tea. Claire rolled her eyes at the ceiling, then leaned toward Michael and whispered, "You see, he thinks this is his hotel." It would have been easy to hate her in that moment, but the camera shifted and I saw Sophie's reflection on the dark of the oven door, wide-eyed, absorbing every word like chalk dust settling on skin. The tablet angle changed. Now it peered from the staircase landing. Claire and Michael stood in the entry coats, half-buttoned, arguing in quiet, urgent tones. "Just list it," she said. "We sell, we start over, he'll be fine. People like him always land on their feet." Michael rubbed his temples. "It's my mother's house," he said. It was. Claire's answer cut the past in two. Then came a softer moment, and it undid me more than the shouting. The camera framed only a corner of the couch and a child's knee in striped leggings. Sophie's voice, smaller than I remembered, floated into the room. "Mom, why do you hate Grandpa?" There was a pause long enough to hope for a gentler reply. None came. "Because he's our debt," Claire said. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into a bucket. Debt, not father, not Edward, not the man who built the very beams around them. The video jumped ahead. Seasons shifted in the windows, leaves, then frost, then a spray of spring rain. I watched holidays pass like shadows, a paper turkey stuck to the fridge with a magnet, a thrift store wreath, a pink construction paper heart. In each clip, my presence was a problem to be solved with contempt, and in each clip the tablet held its ground. The last minute was different. The image wobbled, then settled on Sophie's face, filling the frame. She'd tucked herself into a corner, where the light made her look both younger and older at once. She glanced over her shoulder to make sure no one was there, then leaned in until I could see the tiny constellation of freckles on her nose Ellen used to count for fun. Her voice was whisper quiet, the way children talk to fireflies. "Grandpa," she said, "if you're watching, I love you." The screen went dark. I sat there with the cord humming in the outlet and my hands open on the table like I'd been asked for something valuable and was grateful to give it. Heat rose behind my eyes, not from anger, but from the knowledge that a child had learned to tell the truth in a house where truth was punished. I reached for the phone, found Mark's number by memory, and listened to the ring steady my breath. When he answered, I didn't clear my throat or choose careful words. I gave him the only sentence that mattered. This isn't about revenge anymore. It's about saving a child. Mark promised to review the footage and call a family court contact he trusted, but after I hung up, the cabin felt heavier than before. Evening slid down the mountainside and filled the windows with its blue weight. I was still sitting at the table when I heard tires crunch on the gravel outside. Headlights swept across the porch and died. A knock followed too quick, one hesitant. Only Michael knocks that way. I opened the door to find him holding a six-pack and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, Dad," he said. "Can we talk?" He smelled of aftershave and nerves. I stepped aside. He glanced around the cabin like a man visiting a museum of his own past. We sat opposite each other, the old coffee table between us, our reflections wavering in the glass of the darkened window. "Claire thinks we all said things we didn't mean," he began. "She wants peace." His phone lay face down on his knee, a red light blinking just enough to betray him. I looked at it, then at him. "Peace takes work," I said, "and truth." He nodded too quickly. "You could come back home," he offered. "Maybe sign over some of the assets. Now make things smoother for everyone." His phrasing was careful, rehearsed. I almost admired how well he thought he was hiding it. "You want me to trust you again," I said. "Then tell me, did she send you?" He blinked. "No, of course not." The phone blinked again, recording faithfully. I leaned back and let silence do its work. He filled it as people who lie always do, with words about family reputation, moving on. I watched his hands tremble against the aluminum of the beer can. When he finally ran out of lines, I stood. "I'll think about it," I said. He looked relieved, as if he'd passed some impossible test. "Thanks, Dad," he said, using the word like currency. When he left, his taillights dissolved into the dark and the cabin exhaled. I went to the desk, pulled open the drawer where Ellen kept her letters, and found one sealed in her handwriting, blue ink, steady and unhurried. The envelope read, "For Edward when Michael forgets." I unfolded it carefully, the paper thin and soft from years of waiting. Her voice came alive between the lines. "My dearest Ed, if you're reading this, our son has failed the test I prayed he'd never face. Do you remember when he was 7 and he stole $20 from your wallet? You wanted to believe him when he said the babysitter did it, but I made you confront him. He cried, he admitted, he learned. Life will test him again, not with $20, but with everything we built. And I won't be there to make him face it. Don't save him too early, Ed. If you do, you'll steal his lesson. Let him fall and find his own ground. Only then will he understand what it means to stand." The last paragraph trembled under my fingers. "You'll need the date he first called you Dad. You said it was the happiest day of your life." I made it the password. I remembered it as if it were stitched into my skin, the 15th of August, 1988, the summer we signed the papers that made him ours. I opened Ellen's old laptop, the one I'd kept out of sentiment more than need, and entered the date. The screen flickered, hummed, and displayed a single line. "Trust activated. The son must atone before he inherits." I sat back, the glow turning the room the color of early dawn. Ellen had seen further than I ever could. She had built a safety net out of wisdom and love, not money. I closed the laptop gently, my heart aching with pride and grief in equal measure. She was always 10 steps ahead. Ellen's letter stayed with me for days, its calm wisdom echoing each time I caught my reflection in the cabin's dark window. I didn't need to chase justice. It would come walking on its own legs. The knock arrived in the form of a certified envelope stamped with legal pomp. Claire had filed suit against me for asset misappropriation. The language was slick, likely drafted by some attorney who thought family made for easy prey. I read it twice, the words meaning less than the desperation between them. Mark called that afternoon, his tone half amusement, half inevitability. "She's swinging at smoke, Ed. We'll answer it and let the facts stand up straight." He filed the response before sunset. By the time the court date arrived, snow had begun to fall in lazy, confident flakes, the kind that make a town move slower and speak softer. The courthouse smelled of coffee and dusted leather. Reporters loitered near the steps, sensing the scent of a scandal wrapped in domestic drama. Mark met me inside, briefcase in hand, calm as ever. "You don't speak unless spoken to," he reminded me. "Let their noise undo itself." I nodded. We took our seats at the defense table while Claire swept in wearing a navy suit that probably cost what her case was worth. Michael trailed behind her, hollow-eyed, his loyalty visibly cracking. She avoided my gaze, but I saw the tightness around her mouth, the way pride fights panic when it's cornered. The judge entered, a woman with a spine carved from procedure. Papers rustled. The clerk read the charges. Claire's lawyer began with a performance worthy of a stage, painting me as a manipulative patriarch who'd weaponized paperwork to rob his grieving daughter-in-law. Mark didn't flinch. When his turn came, he stood, adjusted his glasses, and spoke with the patience of a man explaining arithmetic to a room that had forgotten how to count. "Your Honor," he said, "every claim in their filing is contradicted by the public record." He laid out copies of deeds, account statements, and notarized transfers, each page sliding across the table with the soft authority of truth. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he reached the section about the home, he held up the original deed, dated and signed years before Claire married my son. "The property has remained under my client's sole ownership since its purchase," he said. "No liens, no transfers, no co-signers." The judge glanced at Claire. "Mrs. Miller, did you verify this before filing your claim?" Her lawyer leaned toward her, whispering, but she spoke for herself. "We believe the property was marital," she said. Mark nodded, as if agreeing to a weather report. "Belief," he said, "is not title." A ripple of subdued laughter passed through the spectators. He let it settle before adding, "And as for the financial accounts, they were joint with the late Mrs. Miller, not with the plaintiff." He placed the bank's certification on the evidence table. Claire's lawyer tried to redirect, fumbling toward emotion, talking about family betrayal and broken promises. The judge's patience wore thin. "Do you have any tangible proof, counselor?" she asked. He hesitated, then mentioned the alleged loan of $200,000 I had supposedly taken from Claire's business. That was Mark's cue. He opened another folder, extracted the original promissory note with Claire's signature, and handed it up. "Respectfully, Your Honor," he said, "this document reflects the opposite. It is the plaintiff who borrowed $200,000 from Mr. Miller, not the other way around." The courtroom stilled. Claire's color drained as the judge read the paper, lips tightening at the neat signature beneath mine. "Mrs. Miller," she said evenly, "would you care to comment?" Claire's mouth opened, then closed. Her hands twisted together in her lap. For the first time since the hearing began, she looked less like a professional and more like a person realizing the ground beneath her was not foundation but thin ice. The judge set the paper aside. "Case dismissed," she said. The gavel came down with a sound that reminded me of the first hammer I ever swung into framing wood. Outside, reporters clustered at the doors, their breath rising like smoke in the cold. The next morning, the headline ran in the local paper above a grainy photograph of Claire leaving the courthouse, "Real estate agent sued by her own father-in-law." I read it once over breakfast, folded it neatly, and set it aside. Justice didn't need applause. In the echoing quiet of the courtroom, when she refused to meet my eyes, I had already seen what mattered. Pride had turned on its maker. I sat there still as stone while she shifted beneath the weight of her own choices. "You built your own prison." The words I'd thought but never spoken in the courtroom followed me out into the cold. "You built your own prison." I carried that certainty like a stone in my pocket all the way to the cemetery on the hill, where the grass goes brittle under winter sun and the town looks smaller than it feels when you're inside it. I parked by the old maple and walked the familiar path to Ellen's marker, my breath showing itself in little white proofs that I was still here. I had brought a single rose from the cabin, one I'd forgotten in a vase too long, its petals dried into the color of tea. I set it against the granite and brushed away a film of pine needles that had settled there, as if time were always trying to reclaim what we love and ask us to choose it again. "Hi, Elle," I said quietly, "because you don't need to raise your voice with the dead. It's done. Or the loud part of it is." The sky stretched a pale, fearless blue. Somewhere beyond the headstones, a truck shifted gears on the county road and vanished into distance. I put my hand flat on the cool stone and let my thoughts line up the way tools do on a workbench. The judge had dismissed Claire's story with a single sound, and the town would chew on that for a week, like gristle they couldn't swallow, but victory had a weight I hadn't accounted for. It rested across my shoulders, not heavy enough to bow me, but present enough to make me deliberate. Was this justice, or just vengeance in disguise? I tried the question a few ways in my head, like holding a board to the light to see which grain would show a flaw. Justice should restore. Vengeance rearranges. One rebuilds the frame, the other just moves the furniture and calls it new. I told Ellen the whole of it, how Claire had marched into court wearing certainty like it was tailored for her, how it had come unstitched when paper met sunlight. I told her about Michael standing there without a hand to hold and how part of me had wanted to reach for him, and part of me had wanted to let the lesson stand on its own legs. "You were right," I said, tracing the curve of her name. "If I save him too soon, I steal the only thing that might save him." A breeze lifted off the slope and ran through the trees that keep watch over this field. It moved in a way I recognized, a low, steady sound that had filled our kitchen windows on nights the soup simmered and the radio mumbled baseball from the other room. The wind found the withered petals and teased them as if asking whether they still remembered being a living thing. I could almost hear her voice riding in the rustle, that even tone she used when I mistook stubbornness for principle. Protect, but don't destroy. The old argument rose up and softened the way good arguments do when memory sands their edges. I've spent a lifetime measuring spans, angles, loads, knowing that too much force in the wrong place can bring a whole structure down. Strength isn't always a harder hammer. Sometimes it's a shim no one sees, a brace added quietly, where the weight needs help carrying itself. I told her I wasn't chasing any more scenes. No shouting, no parading my proof down Main Street. I would show up with notices, with keys, with the steadiness a child can lean on without fear of splinters. I would answer slander with records, and noise with silence. I would keep the door open for repentance but locked against harm. It felt like prayer, though I haven't used that word in a while. A crow called from the fence line, and then decided against further commentary. I watched a young couple 2 rows over kneel at a plot I didn't recognize, their hands linked, foreheads nearly touching. Grief is the only language everyone speaks with the right accent. I told Ellen about Sophie's video, not the content. I didn't want to stain this ground with that, but the bravery of it, the way a child had held still for truth while the adults around her practiced fictions. "She's the reason I keep my hands clean," I said. "She deserves a grandfather she can be proud of when she's old enough to understand why any of this mattered." I stayed until the sun slid a degree lower and the stone lost its last hint of afternoon warmth. Before I left, I set the rose upright and tucked a small pebble beneath it, a builder's reflex against gravity. Back at the truck, I paused and looked once more at her name. The ache in my chest had changed shape, not an open wound now, but a healed place that still remembers the injury when the weather turns. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket as I closed the door. Mark's name lit the screen above a new message. I expected a follow-up about filings or a dry joke at the town's expense. Instead, I read the words twice before they settled. "Claire's digging into her past now. Something's off." Mark's message tightened something behind my ribs, so I called him from the truck before the engine had warmed. He answered on the first ring and got right to it. "I pulled old personnel records from your firm," he said. 15 years back, an intern named Claire Stevens. Promising. Then a sudden disappearance. I closed my eyes and could see the thin glass wall of my office, the bullpen beyond it, Ellen leaning over a young woman's drafting table with her patient smile. Mark kept going. "There's more. An incident report tied to the firm's insurance carrier non-work assault disclosed by the intern perpetrator, a junior architect from your staff. Your HR notes say Ellen insisted the firm pay for medical evaluation and recommended termination of the employee. Hospital paperwork is attached. Contusions consistent with domestic violence. The intern refused to press charges. The glove box contained an old pen. I found myself clicking it like a nervous student. And Claire, I asked. 2 days later, she resigned by email and never picked up her final check," Mark said. "Ellen drafted a letter for her offering support, names of counselors, a fund drawn from your discretionary account. It was filed but never mailed. The envelope still sealed. I thought of Ellen at the kitchen table, jaw set in that steady way she had when the world needed guarding. "Bring me copies," I said. We met an hour later in his office above the hardware store. Mark slid a thin stack across the desk, a personnel form with Claire's neat signature, my HR manager's tidy notes, a nurse's intake sheet confirming bruising along the ribs and forearms, and Ellen's unsent letter on our stationery. The salutation was simple, "Dear Claire." 2 paragraphs followed in Ellen's hand, no pity in them, only dignity. I read the last line twice. "You are not what someone did to you." The paper made a small sound when I folded it back along the old crease. "She thought I ruined her," I said, "or that I ruined something she thought she needed." Mark nodded. People can live a long time on the wrong story. I called Claire and asked to meet somewhere that wasn't home and wasn't court. She suggested a coffee shop near the office park where she used to brag about landing clients. I chose a table by the window and arrived early, the file in a worn leather folder I hadn't used since the firm holiday parties. She came in brisk sunglasses on top of her head like a crown scanning for danger. "You have 5 minutes," she said, sitting without touching the chair back. I slid the folder across the table and kept my hands in my lap. "You worked for us once," I said. She flipped open the cover with a scoff that died after the first page. Her finger hovered over her own signature from 15 years ago, then moved to the HR note, to the typed name she recognized, to the date stamped at the bottom. "This is a stunt," she said, voice thinning. "You're trying to rewrite." "No," I said softly. "You did that when you left." She turned the page and found the nurse's report. A flush climbed her throat, and something in her posture sagged as if an invisible thread had been cut. "He told me I'd never work in this town again if I said anything," she whispered, the old fear walking back into her mouth. "He said you would protect him." I shook my head. "Ellen walked you to the clinic and sat in the hall while the doctor took pictures. She marched HR through the termination. She drafted this." I set the sealed envelope on the table. She stared, then slid a nail under the flap with a care that didn't match her words. Inside, Ellen's letter unfurled like a kept promise. Claire read it once, then again, lips moving as if sounding out a dialect she had known as a child and forgotten. She reached the line about the fund and stopped. "There was money. Enough for a semester, counseling, rent for a year, if you needed it," I said. "You never came back for it." She pressed her palm to her mouth, that polished ring of gold flashing in the thin light. People nearby laughed at something trivial. The espresso machine hissed. A barista set down cups in a cheerful stack. In the middle of all that ordinary, something extraordinary cracked open on her face, anger sliding off and grief standing where it had been hiding. "I thought you fired him to protect the firm," she said hoarsely. "I thought you were saving yourself." I pointed at the signature at the bottom of the HR form. "Ellen protected you. She wanted you to know the difference between what breaks you and what saves you." Claire closed her eyes, and when she opened them, they belonged to the younger woman I remembered for a heartbeat before the years rushed back in. She looked at the letter one more time and then at me, as if measuring the distance between the story she'd lived and the one that had always been true. "Ellen didn't destroy you," I said, steady as a level on a beam. "She saved you." The room held its breath. Claire's did too, then failed her. She folded forward, elbows on the table, and the first sob escaped with a sound I wouldn't forget. Tears found the paper, darkening the ink. She shook her head as if the motion could undo a decade and a half of misdirected rage. All this time, I was fighting the wrong ghosts. She left the cafe with eyes still wet and letter clutched to her chest, and I walked the long block to my truck, feeling the town staring through its windows. The next days moved like weather. Paperwork turned into court dates, rumor turned into statements, and statements turned into findings. When the clerk read the decision on the fraud count, the sound in the courtroom was not outrage, but something emptier, a collective exhale from people who had suspected the truth and were tired of pretending they didn't. The judge's language was dry, almost merciful in its lack of adjectives, but the meaning didn't need decorations: misrepresentation, deceit, restitution. Claire stood at the plaintiff's table, without her usual armor, fingers bare of rings, hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to ache. She didn't look at me. I didn't look away. Outside, the steps of the courthouse filled with cameras, and for once no one hunted my face. They wanted hers. Headlines did the rest. Clients she'd courted for years stopped answering calls. The phone number on her glossy flyers led to a recording that never offered a tone. In a town like ours, reputations don't fall. They are quietly set down and left behind. I heard about the charity gala from an old colleague who sent an invitation I hadn't requested. "You should be seen," he wrote, as if decency required an audience. I went because the foundation favored Ellen's causes, because there would be women in that room who had survived things they rarely named in public, and because I knew Claire would show up the way people do when they think one grand gesture might turn a tide. The ballroom was all soft light and rented crystal, a string quartet playing arrangements meant to make wealth seem cultured. Claire arrived late in a black dress that might have been elegant if it had not fit like contrition. She moved through the clusters of donors with a practiced smile, hand-extended voice pitched to neutral. At the first table, a woman looked over Claire's shoulder and pretended to hear a name called from across the room. At the second, a man checked his watch, as if remembering a flight. At the bar, the bartender placed a glass of water in front of her without being asked. It wasn't cruelty, it was distance, and distance can bruise more thoroughly than a slap. When the MC thanked sponsors, a line of names filled the screens like a roll call of approval. Claire's brokerage had sponsored for years. Tonight it wasn't on the list. A few people murmured. One woman I recognized from Sunday services glanced at Claire and then at me as if searching for permission to feel what she felt. I gave none and asked for none. We all stood for a survivor's speech, and the room went very still while a woman spoke about the day she realized she didn't have to apologize for her own safety. I watched Claire listen, hands wrapped around the glass she couldn't bring herself to drink. When the lights came up, Michael appeared beside me, thinner than I remembered, the exhausted look of a man who had been sleeping in the wrong house for a long time. He didn't say my name first. He said, please help me fix this. I let the word breathe. For years I had rushed to fill silences for him to smooth the waves so he would not learn how to swim. Ellen's letter had taught me another kind of mercy. This won't be fixed by asking the room to forget, I said. It will be fixed by remembering what the truth feels like. He looked at Claire across the crowd where she stood alone under a chandelier, a woman trapped on a stage she had built for herself. Tell me what to do, he said. Come to dinner, I said. One last time. He closed his eyes as if the phrase carried an extra weight he was finally willing to hold. I'll be there, he said. We stepped into the lobby where the music dulled to a heartbeat under the doors. I remembered 1,000 small moments teaching him to tie his shoes, to measure twice to return what isn't yours, and wondered how many more it would take to teach him how to be a man who doesn't run from consequence. Claire passed us on her way out, face blank as fresh plaster. She didn't meet my eyes, and I didn't offer the comfort that would have been a lie. The night air outside was cold enough to make breath-visible little proofs scattered over the parking lot. My phone vibrated in my pocket. Mark's name lit the screen. I stepped away from the doorway, answered, and listened. His voice was low but steady, a tone reserved for news that matters. Custody hearing moved up. You might win full guardianship of Sophie. Mark was right. The hearing moved faster than anyone expected, as if the court itself had grown tired of half-truths. The judge reviewed Sophie's video in chambers and spoke afterward with the deliberate calm of someone who knows she is rearranging a family's gravity. Temporary custody became permanent in less than an hour. When the gavel fell, I didn't feel triumph, only relief, the kind that comes when a door long warped by weather finally closes. That evening, I drove home to the house that had once felt like exile and let myself in with the same key I'd carried for 40 years. The air still remembered us. I set about preparing dinner the way Ellen used to, table polished roast in the oven, soft music, humming from the old radio that only worked when it wanted to. I laid out 4 plates, forks aligned, napkins, folded candles trimmed. At the head of the table I placed a small framed photo of Ellen smiling in a way that made you believe forgiveness was a natural act. The 4th setting was hers, by 7 headlights washed across the driveway. Michael stepped out first, his posture cautious but unarmed. Claire followed her eyes, scanning the windows like a burglar's. They entered the dining room and stopped. 4 places, Michael asked. I thought it was just us. I gestured to the empty chair. It is us. Vesat. The silverware glinted between us, and for a moment I could almost hear the ghost of laughter that once filled these walls. I poured wine even for Claire and lifted my glass. Ellen, I said, voice steady, thank you for loving even those who forgot how to love. The words settled over the table like a blessing neither of them knew how to accept. Claire stared at her untouched glass, Michael at the photograph. I set my own down and met their eyes. The court granted custody of Sophie to me this morning, I said. Claire blinked as if the sentence had been spoken in another language. Based on the video she recorded, I continued. The evidence was clear: verbal abuse, neglect, intimidation. The judge called it courage in miniature. Claire's mouth opened but found no words. Michael's head dropped into his hands. She's just a child, Claire said finally. She's mine. I slid a thick envelope across the table toward Michael. His name was written in Ellen's hand. Ellen's final test, I said. He looked at me, then at the envelope, then back again. 3 acts of restitution. 1 year to complete them. He drew out the papers and read in silence. Volunteer 200 hours at a domestic violence shelter. Write public apologies to every person you deceived in your business. Attend 52 weeks of family therapy with Sophie and me. His shoulders trembled as he read. Dad, I can't. You can, I said. Because the man I raised isn't finished learning yet. Claire's chair scraped the floor as she stood. Her voice climbed, cracked, and filled the room that had once known gentler echoes. You stole my daughter, she shouted. The candles flickered. I looked at her for what felt like the first time, not the adversary, not the victim of her own ghosts, just a mother who had confused possession with love. "You lost her," I said quietly, "when you taught her cruelty." She took a step back as if the truth had substance. Michael rose, halfway uncertain whether to comfort her or apologize to me. I spared him the choice. "You can both stay for dinner," I said. "Eat. Think. Decide what kind of people you want Sophie to remember." No one moved for a long moment. Then the old clock in the hallway struck 8, each chime closing another distance. Claire sat again, eyes on the plate, but seeing something far away. Michael reached for the serving spoon. We ate in silence. Outside, the first snow began to fall, soft as forgiveness, blanketing the yard that once divided us. When the meal ended, I gathered the plates. Sophie's laughter floated faintly from upstairs, where she was coloring in the study Ellen once used. I felt her presence everywhere, in the calm and the mercy I hadn't known I was capable of. As I blew out the last candle, the smoke curled toward the empty chair and lingered like a benediction. Sophie hugged me while Claire stared at the empty chair, the one meant for Ellen. Sophie's arms still around me became the last clear image of that night. After she went to bed, Michael and Claire left without another word, their car rolling down the driveway like something uncertain of its direction. The next morning, Michael called. His voice was quieter, stripped of excuses. He asked if I could take him to the shelter Ellen used to donate to, the one just outside of town, where women rebuild lives out of safety pins and borrowed hope. I said I'd drive, but only if he went inside alone. When we pulled into the gravel, lot volunteers were unloading boxes of clothes. He stepped out, hands deep in his pockets, looking every bit the man who'd forgotten how to be useful. The director, a woman named Ruth, recognized him from the news but didn't flinch. She handed him gloves and pointed to a stack of donated furniture that needed sanding before resale. I watched from the truck for a while, then drove off, giving him the space Ellen once gave me when I had to learn things the hard way. Over the next weeks, word reached me in small ways. Sophie mentioning that Dad smells like paint now, or Ruth calling to ask if I could spare extra tools. Michael stayed longer each day, cleaning, mending, listening. He never told the women who he was, only that he was there to help. One afternoon, I stopped by unannounced. He was repainting a wall in the common room, sleeves, rolled hair, dusted white. A child tugged at his pant leg, asking for another cookie. He smiled, handed her one, and went back to the brushstroke he'd been perfecting. When he saw me, he froze, then nodded toward the half-finished wall. "Doesn't need to be perfect," I said. "Just strong." He nodded, a quiet agreement passing between us. The next step of Ellen's test came in ink. He wrote the apology letter by hand, because he said typing felt dishonest. I saw the first draft crumpled in the trash at the cabin one night, too formal, too defensive. The second draft began with a single line that stopped me. "My father built houses for people to live in. I spent too long living in excuses." He went on to name each: wrong clients, misled coworkers, slighted his silence when Claire hurt others. When he published it in the local paper, I braced for mockery, but the response was silence first, then respect. One morning, I found a note taped to my truck windshield outside the diner. Took courage to raise him right twice. Sophie read the letter too. She didn't say anything the first time, just folded it neatly and tucked it into her backpack. A week later, she asked if her dad could pick her up from school. I hesitated, then said yes. That evening, she came home with a bracelet she said they'd made together at the shelter craft table. "He's learning," she said, simply, as if reporting the weather. I didn't ask what they talked about. Some reconciliations grow better in quiet. By spring, Michael had completed his 200 hours. He never mentioned Claire. She'd left town after the custody ruling, and even her name felt like a house we'd sold, still standing, but no longer ours. One afternoon, Margaret came by with lemon pie and her old nurse's calm. She sat on the porch watching Michael rake the yard where the snow had finally retreated. "He looks different," she said, "like he put something down." I nodded. "He's becoming the man Ellen always hoped he would be." She handed me a slice of pie, the crust crumbling into the plate. "Do you think Claire will ever change?" she asked. I looked out at the trees just beginning to bud, the air smelling of thaw and possibility. "We'll see." Spring came all at once that year, sudden as grace. The snow melted from the yard in a single week, and the lilac bushes Ellen had planted woke up in a rush of purple. I spent a morning sanding the porch railing and realized my hands didn't ache the way they used to. Margaret was right. Something had shifted. The anger that had kept me upright all those months had done its job and could finally sit down. I wanted to build again, not houses for clients or projects for money, but something that carried Ellen's name forward in a way that healed instead of defended. The idea came while I was fixing a loose shelf in the foundation's office downtown. The receptionist, a young woman juggling bills and a toddler, said she wished she could take a class that taught her how to repair her own home. Men never show you that stuff, she said, laughing it off, but I heard the wish behind the joke. That afternoon, I drafted a flyer for a free class, Basic Home Design and Repair, open to single mothers, taught by Edward Miller, retired architect. I pinned one on the grocery store bulletin board and another at the library. The first evening, 3 women showed up. By the third week, there were 12. We met in the old community center that still smelled faintly of chalk and linoleum. I started with simple things: how to measure a doorway, how to use a level, how to tell when a contractor was overcharging. They listened the way people listen when they've learned not to expect anyone to speak to them with respect. After class, we stayed and talked over coffee. They told me about jobs, lost custody fights, about patching roofs alone in the dark. I told them about Ellen, about how she believed everyone should know how to hold a hammer, even if they never swung it. One night, a woman named Lila asked why I did it. I said, because forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering without letting it poison you. She wrote it down on the back of her notebook and smiled like she'd been handed a key. That phrase became our quiet motto. Someone painted it on the whiteboard in careful script: forgive, not forget. Each week, the class grew. A local hardware store donated supplies. The paper ran a small story about the architect teaching women to rebuild. For the first time in years, my name in print didn't come with scandal attached. The laughter that filled that room sounded like the kind Ellen used to chase through the house. I could almost feel her approval, not as a ghost, but as a kind of warmth behind the ribs. A few months into the program, I came home to find a letter propped against the door. The envelope was pale blue, the handwriting uncertain. Inside was a note from a woman I didn't know. She wrote that she'd once been trapped in a violent marriage, that Ellen's foundation had helped her find shelter and a new start, that she now had a job, a small apartment, and a daughter who slept safely through the night. You and your wife built a bridge I walked across, she wrote. Thank you for keeping it standing. I sat on the porch steps, reading it again and again, until the words blurred. The letter smelled faintly of laundry, soap, and courage. I slipped it into my wallet behind a photo of Ellen and kept it there as a reminder that good work leaves fingerprints you can't always see. Teaching those women began to heal parts of me I hadn't realized were still splintered. Each lesson sanded away a little more bitterness. When someone asked about Claire or Michael, I told them the truth without venom, that people break in different ways, and you can't force them to rebuild. I forgave in pieces, one project at a time. By late summer, the classes had outgrown the community center. We moved into a larger room at the foundation, sunlight streaming through the windows Ellen once chose herself. On the last day of the course, the women surprised me with a framed drawing of a small house under an enormous sky. On the roof they'd written, "Forgive, not forget." I hung it in my office. That evening, while I was closing up, I heard the front door open. Mark stood there in his usual suit, hair rumpled from the wind, an odd brightness in his eyes. "You need to see this," he said, holding out his phone. I wiped my hands on a rag and walked over. His voice softened halfway between disbelief and relief. "The foundation just received $2 million. Mark's voice carried that careful edge between disbelief and awe. $2 million. For a moment I thought it was a mistake, a decimal misplaced, a clerical hiccup that generosity sometimes creates. But Mark was already shaking his head. "Anonymous wire," he said, handing me a printout. "Routing traces back through 3 intermediary accounts." I checked the timestamps. "It was sent last week, the same day you opened the new training program." I looked at the page, the number sitting there like a small miracle. "Michael?" I asked. Mark smiled faintly. "That was my first call." He denied it, even offered to show me his statements. He hesitated, tapping the paper with his finger. "Edward." It came from Claire. The name landed quietly but didn't vanish. I leaned against the edge of the desk and exhaled through my teeth. "Claire," I repeated the syllables strange in my mouth. Mark sat folding his hands the way he does when truth needs space to walk in on its own. "There's more," he said. "I traced a property sale in her name. She sold her mother's house 3 months ago. Liquidated the car, closed her brokerage. Everything she owned is gone." I let the silence breathe. Outside the window, late afternoon light spilled across the parking lot in long amber stripes, the kind that make the world look briefly forgiven. "Did she leave a note?" I asked. Mark nodded and reached into his briefcase. Delivered to the foundation this morning. Addressed to you. The envelope was plain, the handwriting small but steady. I waited until he left before I opened it. Edward, this isn't payment, it's penance. You once told me I built my own prison. You were right. Ellen tried to save me from the first one 15 years ago, and I ran straight into another. I've sold everything I still called mine. The money isn't to make amends, it's to finish what she started. After I read her letter, I realized she saved me twice, once from a man, once from myself. Please don't look for me. Let me work where I can do the least harm and maybe the most good. Tell Sophie her mother remembered what love looks like before it was too late. Claire, I read it 3 times, the words softening with each pass until they blurred. The mention of Ellen's letter stopped me. What letter? I called Mark back, and within an hour he had pieced together the rest. Claire had gone back to the cemetery 2 months earlier. The caretaker remembered her because she'd brought roses and stayed long after closing, sitting cross-legged by the grave. She'd asked if anyone had ever claimed an envelope that had been left years ago in the records file. He'd found it still sealed inside a drawer, the ink faded but legible. Ellen's name on the front, Claire's on the back. No one had ever come for it. I imagined that day in color. Claire, kneeling by Ellen's headstone, fingers tracing the engraved name as she opened the brittle paper. The letter inside, written in Ellen's looping hand. Dear Claire, I know you're afraid. I know shame feels like an anchor, but sometimes it's a life preserver. I've set aside money for you, not to erase what happened, but to help you heal. Use it for school, for rest, for whatever helps you believe in good people again. Come back when you're ready. There will always be a place for you here. Love, Ellen. I could see her reading it, the wind lifting the corners of the page, the sun warming the granite beneath her knees. She must have cried the way people cry when they realize the story they've lived by has been wrong all along. I pictured her walking away from that grave, lighter but lonelier, the first steps toward an apology that couldn't be spoken. Mark's report filled in the rest. She'd returned to the city, sold her belongings, transferred the funds, and disappeared. I doubt she wants recognition, Mark said quietly. But she didn't vanish into nothing. She volunteered at a shelter downtown under her maiden name. That's where the wire originated. I thanked him and hung up. For a long time I sat in the office, the letter on my lap, the hum of the foundation's old refrigerator ticking like a clock. There was no triumph in it, only the strange stillness of things settling where they belong. That weekend I drove to the shelter Mark had mentioned. It was small, a converted warehouse, with murals on the exterior, hands clasping hearts, mended, the kind of optimism only people who've seen darkness can paint convincingly. Inside smelled of detergent and hope. I told the receptionist I was there to drop off donated materials, and she waved me toward the back. The floors shone with the recent wash of bleach. I followed the sound of a mop sliding rhythmically against tile. She was there. Claire. Hair pulled back, wearing plain jeans and a t-shirt that read Safe Haven Staff. She didn't look up right away. The mop moved in slow arcs, her reflection rippling in the soapy water. Nearby, a young woman laughed softly as Claire handed her a folded blanket, saying something I couldn't hear. Her posture had changed. The sharp angles were gone, replaced by a kind of careful humility. She stooped to help another woman pick up a box of donated shoes, steadying her with a hand on the shoulder. For a moment I saw Ellen's kindness moving through her gestures, gentle and unannounced. I stood there unseen, watching the full circle close. This was not punishment. This was transformation, the rare kind you can't script, only witness. I wanted to say her name, to tell her that the money mattered less than this, that forgiveness had already arrived and taken a seat beside her. But some words lose their purity when you speak them too soon. I let the moment stay whole. She wrung out the mop and began again, humming something low and familiar, a tune Ellen used to whistle when she was focused on her work. The sound reached me across the empty hall like a blessing. I turned toward the door, sunlight spilling through the cracked blinds, and left the letter she'd written on the reception counter, for the records, her handwriting next to Ellen's 2 arcs of the same mercy. Then I looked back one last time. She was kneeling to wipe a stain from the floor, hair falling across her face, light catching the edge of a smile that wasn't for anyone but herself. She didn't see me. She didn't see me, and I didn't call her name. That was how it was supposed to end, not with grand gestures or confessions, but with quiet understanding. I left the shelter that morning knowing the story had finally folded back on itself, every wrong note resolved into something softer. The drive home was long enough to think, but not long enough to overthink. Colorado's spring mountains leaned toward summer green, creeping up the slopes like forgiveness, finding its way into cold corners. I stopped by the foundation first. The building hummed with life, volunteers sorting supplies, someone laughing in an office, a child chasing her mother down the hallway. Ellen's picture hung near the entrance, framed by sunlight. Mark was already there, waiting with a folder of paperwork and 2 coffees. "You're really going through with it," he said. I nodded. "It's time." We sat in the small conference room where Ellen once planned her first outreach project. The table still bore faint scratches from years of use, ghosts of elbows and coffee cups and decisions that changed lives. I slid the keys and my signature forms across to him. "You'll do fine," I said. "You've got the heart for it, and I'm done trying to control things that need to grow on their own." He smiled, not with excitement but with the kind of respect that comes from understanding what a gift responsibility really is. "You built something that will last, Ed." I shook my head. "Ellen built it. I just kept it standing until the next hands were ready." We went over logistics, numbers, Grant's plans for expanding the shelter training into other towns. When everything was settled, he hesitated. "Are you sure you want to leave?" I looked out the window at the street below, where people carried groceries, children tugged at sleeves. Life moved on without asking permission. "This place doesn't need me hovering," I said. "It needs room for new stories." I spent the next few days sorting through the cabin, boxing up tools and sketchbooks, deciding what belonged to memory and what to practicality. Sophie came by one afternoon to help, her hair pulled back the way Ellen used to wear it when painting the porch. She dusted shelves while I labeled boxes. "Are you really moving?" she asked. "For a while," I said. "I've seen what I needed to see here." She nodded, trying to be grown up about it, but frowning anyway. "Where will you go?" "Haven't decided. Maybe back east, maybe down to Arizona for the winters. I've got a friend with a vineyard who keeps threatening to teach me about wine." She laughed. "You'll hate it. You'll correct the architecture of the winery before you finish the first glass." Her smile lingered after she left, that easy brightness that reminded me what all this struggle had been for. Margaret stopped by the evening before my departure, a pie in her hands, because some traditions don't need invitations. We sat on the porch, the air thick with the smell of rain and pine sap. "You've earned your peace," she said. I looked out toward the horizon where the last light faded behind the mountains. "Peace isn't earned," I said. "It's accepted. Took me a long time to learn that." She handed me a slice of pie and watched me for a while, then asked the question I knew was coming. "Do you forgive her?" Her tone wasn't judgment, only curiosity, from someone who had walked beside pain often enough to recognize when it loosened its grip. I set the plate down and thought about Claire's bent head at the shelter, about the letter folded in my coat pocket, about the sound of her humming that had carried Ellen's melody forward. "I don't need to," I said finally. "She's already forgiving herself." Margaret nodded slowly, as if the words were heavier than they sounded. We sat until the stars came out small and stubborn against the dark. The next morning I loaded the last box into the truck. The tools rattled faintly in the back, old companions unwilling to rest quietly. I locked the cabin, pressed my palm against the wood once, and whispered a goodbye that wasn't just to the house but to the man who had once lived in it, with clenched fists and sleepless nights. On the way out of town, I stopped by Ellen's grave one last time. The grass had grown tall, dotted with tiny wildflowers. I brushed the stone clean and laid a single white lily on top. "You were right," I told her. "Justice isn't the end of the story. It's the place where mercy begins." The breeze picked up, tugging at my sleeve the same way she used to when she wanted me to come back inside. I smiled and walked toward the truck, not looking back until I reached the main road. The city stretched behind me, small now, almost tender. From here, it didn't look like the site of a war. It looked like a place where something had been rebuilt stronger than before. The road unwound beneath me, mile after mile. The radio played old songs Ellen loved, and for once I didn't change the station. I passed the sign that read, "Now leaving Boulder County," and felt no need to turn around. Somewhere past the state line, my phone buzzed against the dashboard. I almost ignored it, thinking it was Mark confirming some paperwork, but the name on the screen made me slow the truck. It was Sophie. I pulled over on the shoulder, opened the message, and read it in the glow of the dashboard lights. "Grandpa, dinner's ready. We saved your seat." Sophie's message stayed on my screen longer than it should have, the glow softening the road around me until I felt as if the whole world had paused for supper. I turned the truck around before the signal faded back toward the city that had shaped and tested me in equal measure. The mountains were just silhouettes, now dark against the last burn of daylight. By the time I reached the outskirts of town, the streetlights had come on, stretching halos across the pavement. It was nearly a year since I'd left Colorado behind in spirit, and yet driving back felt less like returning than finishing a sentence that had begun decades earlier. The next morning, before heading to Sophie's, I stopped at the Ellen Miller Foundation. The new sign out front caught the sunlight. Ellen's Place, a center for women and children. The lettering was simple, carved from reclaimed wood, the kind Ellen would have chosen herself. The parking lot was full. A row of bicycles leaned against the wall, and through the open door drifted the sound of conversation, of life being rebuilt, one voice at a time. Inside, the air smelled of paint and coffee. A volunteer greeted me with the practiced kindness of someone trained to see worth in every stranger. "You're Mr. Miller, aren't you? We've heard so much about you." I smiled and told her I was just visiting. She led me through the halls, pointing out the new additions: classrooms for counseling, a kitchen for nutrition programs, a small library with donated books. In one room, women practiced interviewing each other, their laughter nervous but determined. In another, toddlers stacked wooden blocks on a bright rug. Everything hummed with purpose. I felt Ellen in every corner, in every wall I had once helped design, with straight lines and right angles that now held something far less rigid: hope. When we reached the art room, I stopped. Sophie was there, her hair tied up, a smear of blue paint across her cheek. She sat among a circle of children, helping them mix colors on their palettes. Her laughter rang through the room like light itself. The teacher looked up and waved me inside, but I stayed in the doorway, afraid to disturb the purity of that sound. Sophie glanced over, spotted me, and grinned. "Grandpa, come see," she called. I stepped closer, pretending to scold her for the paint on her face, but my throat tightened when she held up her drawing. It was a simple picture: a house by the sea with 3 stick figures on the porch, and one more drawn in the sky above, a woman with wings. "That's Grandma Ellen," she said. "She's watching us." I nodded, unable to speak. Around us, the room buzzed with laughter, brushes tapping against glass jars, the soft scrape of chairs on tile. It was the sound of a life continuing unafraid. I stayed long enough to see Sophie help another child pick up a fallen brush, her gestures gentle, instinctive. She had her grandmother's patience. When I finally left the room, I carried her laughter with me like a blessing. Back in my office, I opened the journal I'd kept since Ellen's passing. Most of its pages were filled with sketches, ideas for programs, bits of thoughts that never found a home elsewhere. I turned to a blank page and began to write. "She slapped me once, but life slapped her harder. And somehow it healed us both." I stared at the sentence until it no longer looked like anger or victory, only truth. There had been a time when I believed the worst thing a person could do was humiliate you in front of those you loved. Now I knew the real danger was letting that moment define who you became afterward. Claire's redemption hadn't erased what she'd done, but it had completed the circle. Ellen started the one where pain transforms into purpose if you let it. I closed the journal and placed it in the drawer beside Ellen's old letter, the paper worn thin from being unfolded too many times. Later that afternoon, I took a walk through the courtyard behind the center. A group of women sat beneath the pergola I designed, sharing coffee and quiet conversation. They nodded when I passed, not out of deference, but recognition, as if they understood that we were all survivors of something: grief, guilt time. Beyond them, the garden Ellen had dreamed of was finally blooming. Lavender marigolds and rows of sunflowers, tall enough to brush the edge of the sky. A small plaque at the base read, "Dedicated to those who rebuild." I traced the words with my fingers, the metal warm from the sun, and thought how Ellen would have loved this. The modesty of it, the way it said everything, without needing her name. When evening came, I drove to the coast. The ocean had always been our unfinished plan, the place Ellen wanted to retire to but never reached. I found a quiet stretch of beach where the sand met red rocks and the horizon stretched unbroken. The sky turned the color of old embers, deep orange, giving way to rose, then violet. I parked near the dunes and walked until the surf drowned out everything else. The sea air tasted of salt and endings. I sat on a weathered bench, the journal in my lap, Ellen's letter folded inside the front cover. The waves came and went like breath. I read her words again, not because I needed reminding, but because they sounded different now, lighter, almost playful, like a promise kept. "My dearest Ed, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. Don't chase justice like it's a finish line. Build something worth leaving. And when you finally sit down to rest, make sure it's somewhere with a view. Love doesn't end, Ed. It just changes address." I looked up from the page and out at the horizon where the sun had dipped low enough to turn the water into molten glass. For years I'd been building toward closure, but sitting there, I realized closure wasn't the point. Continuation was. Every person in that foundation, every nail driven, every class taught was a new address for love, a forwarding order that never expired. I thought of Claire cleaning floors under the same roof that bore Ellen's name of Michael's hands steady on a paintbrush of Sophie's laughter echoing through a room filled with women who were learning to rebuild. Even Margaret's steady faith in the goodness of stubborn men. Each of them had become a living proof that brokenness could be mended, not erased. And I, who once thought revenge was the only language left to speak, had learned a quieter one, gratitude. As the tide crept closer, I felt the chill reach my shoes and didn't move. I imagined Ellen beside me, her hand light on my arm, her voice blending with the sea breeze. "You did well," she might have said. Or maybe she wouldn't have said anything at all. We'd never needed many words. I took one last look at the horizon, folded her letter, and slipped it back into the journal. The light dimmed until the world turned to silver and shadow. Somewhere behind me, a family's laughter rose above the wind, a sound of life refusing to fade. I stood, brushed the sand from my coat, and took a deep breath. The years ahead would be quieter, but not empty. I had done what I came to do: protect, restore, forgive. The rest belonged to them now, to Sophie, to Michael, to Claire, to every woman who would walk through the doors of Ellen's place and find safety where once there was only fear. The sky bled red along the horizon, a painter's final flourish before night. I watched the sun sink into the sea, its last reflection shimmering across the water like a thread stitching heaven to earth. I whispered her name once, not as a goodbye, but as a thank you. Then I smiled because for the first time in a very long time I understood what she meant about views. They thought they broke me, but they only reminded me who I was and who she taught me to be. Every story has a beginning that hurts and an ending that heals. Edward's journey began with humiliation and silence at a dinner table, but it ended with purpose, compassion, and peace. What was once an act of cruelty became a lesson in legacy. Through forgiveness, he built more than a foundation, he rebuilt lives, including his own. Ellen's love lived on through every class, taught every woman sheltered and every child who learned that kindness can outlast pain. Sophie's laughter became the echo of that truth, a reminder that sometimes the smallest hearts carry the greatest wisdom. Claire's redemption was not about being forgiven by others, but about learning to forgive herself, proving that even those who fall the farthest can still rise if shown the way. As the sun set on Edward's final chapter, it wasn't revenge that defined him, but restoration. He didn't just win back dignity, he passed it forward. If this story touched you, share it with someone who believes in second chances and the power of quiet strength. Tell us in the comments, have you ever seen forgiveness change someone's life, including your own? And if you were in Edward's place, could you let go of the pain and choose peace instead? Your thoughts may help someone find the courage to begin again.